Let's see here, making sure that, all right, it looks like we're live on, let me see here. I usually just check on my YouTube and stuff like that, because last time I did this, it did not connect. It was something going on, and I was like, why is this? All right, yep, we are live. This is awesome. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are so glad that you are here. We are doing Hey Girl Hey with Brandi. My name is Brandi. I am your host today, and I have my special guest here, Dr. Jodi Nicholson, and I'm going to go over briefly about her. But first, before we get started, I really would like to go over a few things before we get started. So first off, I want to go over what is Hey Girl Hey with Brandi. Hey Girl Hey with Brandi is a conversation about really truly talking about the beauty transformation. A lot of the times, the first beginning starts is that you have to start with your mental health, your mind, the mindset. Because once you can get a grasp on that and start healing in those areas, it is really easy for us to fall into these other areas and our authentic self, just being us. And so Hey Girl Hey with Brandi brings licensed professions on board to talk about trauma, because I went through trauma, and as well as having just a real conversation about mental health and other people who have gone through trauma to talk about their story. Now, I will like to put a disclaimer out there. Hey Girl Hey is a platform to discuss mental health and learn from professionals and those with their own experiences. If you believe at any point that you need support or additional help, please reach out to a professional. And this is part of me starting Hey Girl Hey, is to expose you to professionals, that this is their specialty, this is their genius, and I want to get you the help that you need, or expose you to those who can get you the help that you need. The information shared here is not in lieu of getting professional support. So let's go ahead and kick this off. Let's go ahead and start Hey Girl Hey. Jodi is my special guest here today. She is the one who actually started off Hey Girl Hey. Originally, I reached out to Jodi impromptu to ask her to come on and to talk to my guest, and it was a tremendous success. And so from there, I decided to start Hey Girl Hey. Jodi is she is a mom to two beautiful children. She is a wife to her wonderful husband David. She is a licensed professional counselor and also owns her own practice. She has experience on working with underserved communities and helping them getting the resources that they need to ensure that they take care of their mental health. Jodi, was there anything that I missed?
No, you covered it all.
Awesome. Well, let's get to it. Let's go ahead and start our conversation talking about trauma. And I know, Jodi, you know my story, and you've been with me long enough to know about what happened to me. And for those of you who do not know and you are new to Hey Girl Hey, a lot of what I do has been birthed out of me finding joy out of something so traumatic that happened to me in my life 10 years ago, where I was stabbed multiple times in my home by somebody that I knew. And so out of that, I find myself spreading joy through my makeup, through doing segments like this, on my social media, and all the things that I could do to connect with people. So, Jodi, I really want to touch on some of the conversation that I know you've been having with a lot of my followers and people who have been engaged and been watching, to talk about how are you and other professions, or just more specifically you, servicing underserved communities when it comes to trauma?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me back, Brandi. So one way that I specifically serve underserved populations is specific to trauma is that in my private practice, I do reserve an allotted number of either what we call sliding scale or pro bono sessions. So for those who may be unfamiliar with some of those terms, sliding scale sessions are pretty much based on what a client is able to afford based on their income. So it's usually substantially lower than a clinician's usual fee. And then there's also pro bono sessions that I offer, which I usually reserve a number of those on my caseload at a time for clients who otherwise would not be able to access my services. So I allow them to see me free of charge. And in that way, they have access to a licensed professional who does have experience and training in trauma-specific therapies that they may not otherwise have access to.
And so, Jodi, how do you feel that that's helping our community? You know, living in, for those of you who don't know, I was from straight up Stop Six, and those communities really didn't talk about mental health, or it was, you know, you're just being crazy, or it was super dismissed. So how is these communities receiving this information, and are they taking it in? Like, how is that going?
Yeah. So I think a lot of what therapy is in general, for me anyways, my goal is to normalize getting help and taking care of your mental health and well-being, regardless of where you come from, what your backstory is, what your, socioeconomic status is. Really normalizing that it's okay to seek that type of help. And so I think that's a challenge that is often faced in underserved populations. Because it's either not accessible, or in some cases it's even criminalized when they when their mental health issues are on display. There's usually some type of negative consequence that doesn't look like therapy or treatment. So I seek to, with all clients, but especially clients in underserved populations, to normalize coming to therapy and really to validate their experience so that they don't feel, they feel accepted, and that they don't feel, I'll use air quotes here, crazy, because I think a lot of people, especially, certain communities, certain cultural backgrounds, there's just in general, there's still a stigma with seeking mental health. So I just really try to validate their experience and start there.
So with someone, and that's really good. So I want to touch on you saying it's criminal. What does that mean? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think we start to see this, even at a young age in our school and education systems, where we'll see children in particularly underserved communities that are dealing with mental health issues, dealing with trauma. And I'll talk a little bit about the 3 types of trauma, but they're dealing with, one of the types is chronic or complex trauma. And that often, manifests as behavioral issues. And so instead of maybe getting the mental health treatment that they need, they receive disciplinary action. And there's research behind, the pipeline to prison that starts in the education system with children who are routinely suspended, or, their mental health issues are not treated, but rather they receive disciplinary action. And we see that replicated throughout the lifespan in these populations because their mental health needs are not being adequately addressed.
That's really good, Jodi. So yesterday I was watching, so Leonard put me up to scuff because I was like, no, Leonard, I did not watch The Breakfast Club. he was like, I'm taking your card away. And I was like, bruh, hold on. So one of the guys from the Breakfast Club, it's funny that you mentioned that because he started talking about his segment yesterday was healing. We turned it off, but the pieces that I got was really tying to what you were just talking about. And I thought it was so relevant that I was listening to him last night and knowing that you were coming on, and this was some stuff that I wanted you to go over, is that he talked about getting whoopings and like the discipline, him getting in trouble, and how he was talking about how our community, how we would say, he was like, have you ever thought about like why your mom would say, what you crying about? I'll give you something to cry about, or different cliches that we would say, or why are you, it would be, sorry, y'all hear the baby. Sorry. But he was saying something about how you would get these whoopings, but they were from hurt. They were actually from them not dealing with their trauma, and how we didn't talk about these things. But I thought it was so relevant that he was talking about that. He did mention he was glad that we're getting to a space where we can normalize it, but we need to do more of it. And unfortunately, and just to your point, Jodi, is that a lot of communities, underserved communities, don't have the resources, or they're not talking about it because they just think it's something that they just have to take on. And so from that perspective, Jodi, especially because that's that's the neighborhood that I came from, you know, how does that affect us mentally and personally as we become adults and grow up and didn't deal with it in childhood?
Yeah, I think it can affect an adult in various ways if you experience childhood trauma. And before I go into that, I'll go ahead and segue and talk a little bit about the three types of trauma. The three main types of trauma. There's acute trauma, which is usually one or a single traumatic experience. There's chronic trauma, where you may be re-traumatized repeatedly. An example may be, domestic violence, where that trauma there's repetition to that. And then complex trauma is a more layered trauma. So you may have different types of trauma experience. And we tend to see a combination of complex and chronic trauma in our underserved communities. So complex trauma can look like you're living in an abusive home. Your basic needs aren't being met. You may be going without food or clothes, or, those basic necessities that kind of layer on that trauma. Maybe you're exposed to violence in your community, death, all of that you start to layer that trauma on, that makes it what we call that complex trauma. So as an adult, if there's no intervention and you don't really get the tools and how to cope with that in a healthy way, because we all cope with it in some kind of way. It's either going to be a healthy or unhealthy way. We tend to see, if you don't get any sort of intervention through therapy, that you tend to resort to unhealthy ways of coping throughout the lifespan, and definitely into adulthood. So that could be, addictions, that could be, engaging in risky behaviors, sexual behaviors, things like that. It could involve, self-harm, self-injury. Those are some ways that we tend to see people with unresolved traumas that's their experiences as they get older as adults. And then also, to your point with from the Breakfast Club example, we can pass those traumas on if we don't learn healthy coping tools. We can then, pass those on to our children in terms of how we are not really coping with it in a healthy way. So if you are disciplining your child, out of anger or out of your own unresolved trauma, now you're then traumatizing your child, whatever that discipline looks like. So that's kind of the issue that we run into, is that it becomes cyclical and generational when there's no intervention.
Wow. And that is so deep for me, because I think about some of the, and I mentioned this with Baloo as well, is
Mhm.
some of the, I didn't recognize, and that's the thing, like we don't, as a people, as a woman of color, I don't think that we recognize that we're operating in trauma. Like, and
Yeah.
it's kind of bad. So like, Jodi, how can we recognize if we are? Like,
Mhm.
because sometimes we just don't know. I
Yeah.
know I probably was, because I would find myself being angry a lot, and my dad was like that. Now, of course, I was raised by a Hispanic. Nothing
Mhm.
against Hispanics, but the culture is that the male is very dominant, and certain things are supposed to be done a certain way and so forth. So when those things are not done, it results in anger. And
Mhm.
so some of that was passed down, and I would find myself in certain situations where I will respond in
Mhm.
anger. And so how can somebody who's walking around with traumatic, painful experiences and
Mhm.
recognize that they're operating in that?
Yeah. I think a big part of it is just education. Because like to your point, our trauma, the way that we experience it, the way that we cope with it, can be normalized if that's how we also saw our parents, the generations before us, deal with it.
Yeah.
And so I think just education around that, around what trauma symptoms look like, so that we can be able to identify them in ourselves, so that we
Mhm.
can maybe be able to identify them in others. If you're working, with certain populations in schools and things like that, you can be able to recognize that this may be a symptom of trauma. The actual label for it now is trauma informed, so
Mm.
that um, medical professionals, teachers, I mean, anyone can be educated on what trauma looks like, so that there can be opportunity for intervention. And I think that's the way that people will begin to learn and see that what they're experiencing
Yeah.
is not uncommon, but it's also not normal, even though that's what they've grown up with, that it's not necessarily normal, and that there is help.
Yeah, that's good. So I know that you mentioned too, Jodi, something about healthy coping when it comes with trauma. Um, what does that look like? Like, I don't think I've ever heard that before. Like somebody
Mhm.
saying to me, like, when I think of my situation and how traumatic it was, and everybody's situation is different. So your situation may be traumatic to you versus mine. Mine was more physical, but there was an emotional aspect to it, because
Mhm.
there was, what you're saying, a little bit of complex to it, because now that thing was affecting other things that I already didn't deal with. And so what does
Yeah.
healthy, coping actually look like?
Mhm. Yeah. Um, Healthy coping, I believe, starts with therapy, and starts with
Okay.
being educated on some of those trauma symptoms that we talked about, and working with a therapist to identify how the individual's trauma experience affected them on the individual level, so they can start
Yeah.
to learn to cope with that in a healthy way. Um, when I think of or talk to clients about healthy coping,
Hmm.
my approach, I focus on belief systems. So, what are you believing
Okay.
about yourself based on the trauma that you experienced? Are you believing
Yeah.
something that's healthy? Are you believing something that's unhealthy? And how
Yeah.
can we get you to shift to a healthier mindset? That also, healthy coping could also look like taking care of yourself. If you are, um, using drugs and alcohol, or even food or other things to self-medicate, you
Hmm.
know, getting help with that, so that you don't feel that so that you don't resort to unhealthy ways medicating. And I'm, you know, a supporter of medication when and if that's needed. And some symptoms of trauma require that. But otherwise, yeah, definitely making sure that you're taking care of yourself, getting some type of physical movement. Yoga therapy is really good for trauma because trauma lives in the body. And so yoga therapy can be helpful with that. And any other type of exercise. Those are some ways to cope with trauma, as well as journaling, support groups. Those can also help, again, to help you really make sure you're processing your experience in a healthy way, and also feel like you're not alone in what you're experiencing.
Yeah, that's the thing. And that's part of the reason why Hey Girl Hey even exists, is because there was a part of me where, like you said, there was some isolation. There was places where I felt alone because I did not have anybody to speak with or know how to properly say what was emotionally going on inside of me. I didn't know how to process that because I've never experienced anything like that. So, and I've never seen anybody experience something so traumatic where they showed me an example of how to process the emotions when you go through something like that. So there was times where it was difficult, people asking me like, Brandi, are you okay? And it was just like, what? Like, I don't know, and
Yeah.
and sometimes for the person that has dealt with something like that, that's their response, but it's not always the best response because they're not okay. That they're trying to understand these emotions that they're going through. So what are some questions that we could be asking ourselves or be asking someone that we know who's going through something traumatic or has gone through something traumatic to help them process what they're feeling? Because I know sometimes, Jodi, people will say, I'm good, or nah, I'm, nothing's wrong with me, or girl, I'm gonna be okay, and those are ways of, I feel like, to me, those are ways to push back, not really wanting to deal with it or talk about it, because it really is a true problem, but they don't want that. It's not right now. So
Yeah.
how can somebody do that?
So I would approach it by, number one, just validating the experience. I know that even if you don't know the details of what they experience, I know that you went through X, Y, and Z, or I know that you experienced something that was really scary or that was really traumatizing, if you want to use that word. I think trauma is self-defined. So I know that you went through something really difficult. And it's okay if you're not okay. Just normalizing that part of it. And I'm here if you need, if you need someone to talk to, I'm here to support you in whatever that looks like. And I'm here to help you access resources if you need to. I think just being there and being present with someone who's experienced trauma is really the biggest thing that you can do. And that's really a lot of what we do in therapy, is what we call holding space, is being present with the other person in whatever way they need us to be present with them. Whether if they feel like they're ready to talk about their story, if they need to cry, if they just need to feel validated and accepted in spite of what they may have gone through or what they may be feeling. Because there can be a lot of shame with trauma experiences.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, being able to sit with someone in that space and they feel like this person is not judging me. They're just taking me as I am, whatever comes out, I think can be really powerful and really, a big part of the healing process that sometimes we take for granted.
Yeah, and that's really, and that's so good, Jodi. Knowing that sometimes some friends or some family members, they don't know how to hold that space for you.
Yeah.
Because we're all in this, I don't want to call it a movement, but in this normalizing, talking about what is really going on with us. And so we have to be trained to know how to even support you. For someone who has gone through that, to be able to hold this space and then be able to open up and say, hey, I see that you need additional help. I'm
Right.
here to help you. I'm here to support you. But I also see the layer of where I think a professional needs to step in. And sometimes that's hard as a friend. You
Yeah.
don't, sometimes you don't want to say that because you don't want to offend the person.
Mhm.
But you're, sometimes as a friend, you're thinking about, I'm beyond wanting to, if I offend you or not offend you, I'm beyond that. My concern is more about the care of you.
Yeah.
That's more important. So if I offend you, at this point, I'm like, oh, well, I feel the need that you need the additional support. And I
Yeah.
think when I think about, my situation, Jodi, and just everything that you've gone over, there was a point where I was angry because I felt like I wasn't supported in certain areas. But as I have grown, I recognize that they didn't know how to support. They just didn't know
Yeah.
how. All they knew how to
Mhm.
do was to show up. So I say to the people who are listening, give your, to the person who is supporting somebody like that, give yourself some grace. And then to the person
Mhm.
who is dealing with it, have grace on the people, because
Mhm.
they're learning too. They don't know how to do this as much as you may not know how to process the
Mhm.
information or the emotion. And so, that's another layer, Jodi. How does
Mhm.
someone who sees somebody who has dealt with that or somebody who is dealing with that, how do you give the people grace, to say
Mhm.
like, I don't know how to do this. All I know is I need to
Yeah.
be here, but I don't know what else to do. Help me understand.
Yeah.
Like, how do you give each other that grace? What does that look
Yeah.
like?
Well, I think just kind of like what you said, being able to say and acknowledge that, I don't have all the answers, as a friend or loved one who's supportive, knowing what your limitations are, and that
Mhm.
you are not stepping in a role to be their therapist, particularly if you have your own unresolved trauma, because that can everyone can't hold space in that way, and that can maybe
Yeah.
trigger the other person's trauma as well, unresolved trauma.
Mm.
So I think just being able to really define what to yourself, if you're that support person, what does that mean for you? That means I'm going to um, be that friend if you need someone to talk to, that I'm gonna share resources with you that I know, or I'm gonna help you maybe make that first call to your counselor, or
Yeah.
accompany you to your first counseling appointment. Um, whatever that looks like for the individual, I think it's important for them to really have a clear idea of what capacity they feel like they can support their loved one. And yeah, like you said, if you're the person receiving the support, just knowing that people, may not always have the quote unquote right thing to say. They may
Yeah.
not know what to say, but we're all just trying to do our best.
Yeah.
And in that way, thinking of it in that way, I think can help us to have a little bit more grace towards people who are trying to support and navigate maybe things that they've never had to experience.
Yeah. No, and that's really good. And that is so helpful because I didn't have anybody to tell me that. I was more angry at
Mhm.
the support that I wasn't getting, but not recognizing that these individuals have never experienced anything to that degree, or at that moment in time, they weren't taking what would be considered their trauma
Mhm.
and align it to what I was going through, because
Mhm.
trauma was different for everyone. And
Mhm.
so that doesn't resonate with them. And so they don't know how to be there or to be that support. And so, like Jodi said, like just, help them validate that these emotions are real, what they're feeling is real, and that you are here
Mm-hmm.
for them to support them, and that you will be there at their first appointment if you need me to be there, or I could be the
Mm-hmm.
person to make the phone call for to set up the sessions, whatever you need me to do. If you need me to text you once a week to make sure that you're journaling and you're getting all these emotions out, that those are different ways that you can support individuals who are going through something, or that going through the aftermath of going through something traumatic. And that is so helpful. But I don't think we know that. We focus on the person who is the victim, who has been victimized, but we
Mm-hmm.
don't, I don't see too much, Jodi, around like how do we help the support system to allow
Mm-hmm.
these individuals to have space, because that's
Mm-hmm.
hard for the people supporting, and also the
Mm-hmm.
person who has been victimized. Like they don't,
Yeah.
they're already, they're dealing with it, but then the people who are supporting are finding it hard to support them. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's super helpful
Mm-hmm.
to have that information. Yeah. That's really good. So Jodi, where we ran a couple of minutes beyond time, but I can't
Mm-hmm.
thank you enough for joining me. If anybody wants to get in contact with you, how can they contact you, Jodi?
They can reach me by phone at 682-463-1012, or they can email me at my super long email address, Dr. Nicholson at pathways, the number 2 healing.net.
Yes, yes. And for those of you who are watching or watching the replay, Jodi has been with me before. So that information has been posted, but I'll be sure to post that same information on the YouTube video, because this will be now on YouTube. So I appreciate that. Is there any services and offerings or anything that you want to tell our viewers about, Jodi?
I do have my private practice, as you mentioned, in Crowley. If anyone's interested at the time, I only see 18 and older. I
Okay.
offer virtual as well as in office sessions in my office in Crowley, Texas.
Yes.
So I am trained in EMDR, which is a trauma specific therapy. If anyone is interested in any type of therapy, but especially anything related to trauma, those are the services that I offer around that.
Awesome. Thank you, Jodi. Thank
Mhm.
you so much. I
Thanks for
honor
having me.
you. Thank you so much. You have been a great help of really kicking off Hey Girl Hey, and all the information that you provided to all of my viewers and listeners. Thank you so much for joining us. We really do appreciate it. Happy Friday to all of you, and thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next Friday. Next Friday, I will have Tahoya Jackson on. She will be sharing her experience and a lot of the work that she's doing in the space of Hey Girl Heal. And she has had encounters with Taraji. So we're going to hear about her story, and we will be showing up next week, next Friday at around 7:30. I honor everyone's time, and if they can't make it, I want to make sure that we make it flexible for them. So anyways, I will see you next Friday here, same place, different time. But you'll be hearing from somebody else who has recovered from a very traumatic experience. Thank y'all for watching.